Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our clients on the call. Welcome to our partners and welcome to our guests. It's great to see so many people joining this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rob May. I'm the Managing Director of Ramsac, and I'm also the ambassador for cybersecurity for the Institute of Directors. And I'm a TEDx and an international keynote speaker specializing in cybersecurity. I think before we start, the one thing that we need to be acutely aware of is that human behavior is vitally important with cybersecurity. It's that understanding that it's my behavior and your behavior and the behavior of all your colleagues that is the heart of the problem. It's the greatest line of defense, and it's also the greatest weakness. And we talk about that as being the human firewall. And having that understanding and appreciation of the human firewall is very important. And I'm going to be talking today about the human firewall generally, but also some of the additional considerations that we need to be thinking about in this COVID-19 world. Now, why cybersecurity is so important? I think one of the things that many people miss is that it is enforced under law and punishable under law. And the GDPR that came into effect on the 25th of May 2018, that governs cybersecurity, and it governs what happens when you have a data breach. And we have to so if you have a data breach, you have to report that legally within 72 hours of you becoming aware of that breach. If the device that was involved in the breach wasn't encrypted, so let's say your data breach is somebody's lost a laptop or had a machine stolen or whatever. If that machine was encrypted, then what the law says is you need to report it to the ICO within 72 hours. If it wasn't encrypted, you've also got to report it to all of your clients within 72 hours. And that's something that we need to be aware of. And any director in your organization is liable for that breach. And it's not just about the fine. It's not just about the potential 20 million euro fine. It's also potentially the risk of a director of your organization going to prison. So it's vitally important. Now, much of what we've seen in terms of breaches reported in the press to date have not been under GDPR. So the way the law works is when the prosecution goes to court, the prosecution will be based on what was law on the date of the cybersecurity breach. And much of what we've seen thus far over the last 2 years have still been prosecutions under the Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act was the law that governed this before GDPR, and that had been around for 20 years. Now, the one big breach that we have seen in the press and we have seen go to court under GDPR is British Airways. British Airways had a 15-day cybersecurity hack. The criminals sat on the BA website and they stole the payment information and the whole order process for 380,000 customers. This was their credit card details, their address, dates of birth, passport information, and so on and so forth. And we know it's 380,000 people because all that information is for sale on the dark web. Now, this was a a difficult breach for BA. It ended up with 3 days of cancelled flights, 726 flights in total. It left 75,000 passengers stranded around the world. And at the time that this happened, the newspapers reported that BA were going to be fined £500 million. Now, the £500 million came from the fact that under GDPR, if you have a cybersecurity breach, your maximum fine is 20 million euros or 4% of your global turnover, whichever is the largest figure. And in 2017, BA's total turnover was 12.2 billion pounds. So 4% of that, that's where you get your 500 million. Now, I said that I'm the ambassador for cybersecurity for the IOD, and I was doing when this hit the press, I was asked to do a radio interview. And I said at the time that I didn't think that BA would be fined 500 million pounds. And the reason for that was that on the face of it, they seem to have done everything properly. There's a process that you have to go through, and they seem to have done that properly. And the CEO came out and he made his statement to the press, and they did a lot to put things right for their passengers and so on. And the one comment that I made at the time was that the only thing that I couldn't comment on was what BA's approach to DPIAs were. Now, DPIA is really important. A DPIA is a data protection impact assessment. And every one of you needs to have done a DPIA. But not only that, a DPIA is not a one-off occurrence. This wasn't something that you needed to have done whilst you were preparing for GDPR. It's something that needs to be in your ongoing process. And a DPIA is a risk assessment, just like any other risk assessment that you would do in your business. But it's a risk assessment for your data. So what data do we have? Where is it? Who's got access to it? How is it backed up? Where's it stored? And so on. And what are the risks? And the law says that we have to do DPIAs. And I couldn't find any evidence of what BA's approach to it at the time was. But other than that, it looked like everything was okay. Now, we do know what happened to BA because it's now gone to court. And in actual fact, they were fined 183 million pounds. So not the 500 million that the press were claiming. 183 million is still an awful lot of money. It's 1.5% of their global turnover. And as I said, it could have been 4%. I Googled to see how many people had flown with BA during that 12-month period. And that 183 million equates to £4 per annual passenger. And in the country where the prosecution takes place, it's the government who get that money. So in the UK, and I know we've got some overseas visitors dialed into the session this morning, but in the UK, it would be the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, that would do the prosecution. They do that on behalf of the government, and that 183 million pounds would then go to the government. I think the key thing here is that if you think compliance to GDPR is cumbersome or expensive, non-compliance is a whole nother ballgame. And I wonder how you value your security and what price you put on that. There's an annual event that takes place at Olympia every June called InfoSec. And InfoSec is the industry cybersecurity event. All the cybersecurity specialists from across EMEA come together for a couple of days to talk about the latest tech, the latest problems, the latest scams, solutions, and so on. It's a fantastic couple of days. And whilst InfoSec was on, they ran a experiment at Liverpool Street train station in London. And what they were doing is they were stopping commuters on their way into work and on their way home. And they were asking them three initial questions. And the three questions were, what's your name? Who do you work for? And what's your computer password? Now, amazingly, 34% of people who were stopped filled out the form, which is bonkers, right? But it's worse than that, because anybody who said no on your bike or some other such retort, the people who were doing the survey were surrounded by boxes of Mars bars. And they said, what if I gave you a Mars bar? Well, amazingly, 70% of people who they stopped filled out the form. And whilst the cynic in me would suggest that a whole load of people will have lied just in order to get a Mars bar, the fact that 34% of people filled this out from the get-go means that a chunk of this data will have been legit. And cybersecurity or cybercrime is a numbers game. They don't always win. They fail more often than they win, but they don't need to win all the time in order to get a good payday. So that shows you that whilst you might take your security seriously, the statistics would suggest that some of your colleagues won't be. And that people aren't taking this seriously, but it's a really serious problem. Someone's identity is stolen online every 15 seconds. In the UK, the Royal Mail created an advert to try and educate people about this, and unfortunately, the advert was banned, and they weren't allowed to show it on television. I want to show it to you now because I think it's important that we see this. Take a look at this.
Thank you. See you again. Hello there. How can I help?
On your knees! On your knees! You! Get out of here now! We don't want your money. Right! What's your name?
Nicola.
Full name,
Nicola Davies.
What's your date of birth?
26th of April, 1989.
Address, quick.
97 Stanley Avenue, Gideon Park.
What's your date of birth?
It's,
What's your date of birth?
25th of the 5th, 85.
Got any children?
Well, I do want to know.
I'm in a rush!
Yes.
What are their names?
Liam and Olivia.
Your mother's maiden name.
Walters.
What?
Just Walters.
Come on!
Jones. Do you understand?
Now do what we ask! I'm asking the question. What's your email address and password? Password!
Got it? Right, let's go.
It's quite harrowing, isn't it? But it really makes the point, and I think it makes the point well. And when you reflect on that Liverpool Street experiment, it's clear to see that people don't get it. And one of the things that we have to do, and one of the things that helps with this, of course, is education. And I wonder how you educate when it comes to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity education is now a legal requirement. GDPR insists upon it. When you report your breach, and I've already told you that you need to do that within 72 hours, what happens is the ICO take you through a series of questions. And dependent on how you answer those questions will depend on the likelihood of you being investigated. The fourth question you get asked, so you get asked your name, your company, the date and time that you became aware of your breach, because you might not become aware of the breach when it happens. The fourth question is the member of staff who was involved in that breach, what was the date of their last cybersecurity education? It's absolutely vital. And if you are doing training, and the official stats at the moment say that a third of businesses are doing training, so there's a problem for those other 2/3. If you are doing training, it's absolutely paramount that you record that. You need to have proof. You need to have an audit trail. You need to be able to record and show who's had the training and when. What I often get when I'm doing workshops on this is I often get people who say to me, well, we've got really good policies around this, and we've got something in the staff handbook, and it's part of our induction process. And you know, when we have a new starter, we take them through it. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Harvard University did a fantastic survey, and I use the findings of this survey all the time. It found a number of things. The first thing it found was that when we've got an important message to share, we put, as business people, we put 85% of our effort into the written content. So 85% of our effort goes into the written content of a message. Now, this might be a policy, this might be a sales message, you know, a note to your staff, or advertising or whatever. We put all this effort into that written content. The study then showed if you send that written content to 100 people, and 100 people read it. So let's say this is an email. So you send an email to 100 colleagues in your organization, and everyone reads it. What they showed was only 3% of those people cognitively retain the message. 3%. And what the study also showed is that on average, an intelligent person needs to hear a message 6 times before they get it. And I think we're all guilty of sharing something and thinking, right, I've told them that, I've done it, I've ticked the box. And what the Harvard study showed is that actually, if this is an important message, we need to share it at least 6 times. And I think, you know, in the COVID world, unfortunately, we've seen a massive spike in malware. It's a big problem. There's a lot of clickbait. There's a lot of fake news. There's a particular problem. There's a series of scams where they're maps, and it's to show you COVID-19 virus outbreaks. There's one that is to show you how many people have caught COVID-19 in your actual geography. Be really, really careful with these. There's a lot of scams, and unfortunately, they're not just targeted at users. We're seeing hospitals and healthcare workers who are really, you know, under horrendous pressure at the moment, also being targeted. This is a great opportunity for you to be doing your compliance training. You've legally, you've got to do it. You've got people working from home. This is a great chance for you to start to roll out some of this training. If you've never done any, look, start with my TED Talk, if you like. It's completely free of charge. I am not saying for 1 minute that this is the be all and end all of training. It certainly isn't. And we do an awful lot of different cybersecurity education products and services, which are chargeable services. But if you've never done anything, get people to watch my TED Talk. If you just Google TEDx Human Firewall, there's also a link there on the side of the slide, but it will come up on the TED website. What you could do is do a Teams meeting like this, or a Zoom meeting, get everybody together and show them the video. It's 15 minutes, and it's a good overview, and it helps that process. But there's nothing under GDPR that defines what cybersecurity trading is. You've just got to be able to prove that you are doing it, and you need to be doing it regularly. Remember, an intelligent person needs to hear something 6 times. So if you've never done anything, you could do this today, and it's not going to cost you anything. But remember, it's vitally important that you have a record of who's done it. And again, that's why you might want to do this in a Teams meeting, for example, because you've then got the record of everybody who's participated. You might do it in Teams, you might do it in Zoom. There's quite a lot of talk in the press at the moment about security issues with Zoom. And look, there are some problems. Zoom are addressing them, and they're addressing them quickly. They weren't prepared for the ramp up in users. In December, Zoom had 10 million users. By the end of March, they'd got 200 million users. That's massive growth. And we've seen some problems. We've seen there was a data breach of Zoom usernames and passwords that unfortunately came out last week. You may have seen press about Zoom bombing. Zoom bombing again has been fixed. There was an update on the 5th of April. And that's fixed some of these problems. But even though those problems have been fixed, one of the things you need to be aware of is if you've got appointments, Zoom calendar appointments that have been set up before the 5th of April, best advice is that you go in and you reset up that appointment and refresh it so that it's using the new settings. Previously, meetings didn't have to have a password. That's now automatic. My advice is that you set screen sharing to host only. So one of the Zoom bombing issues is where somebody on a call takes control of the screen. Disable file transfer. Again, they've now insisted on auto waiting, so people can't join the meeting before the host. And then also there's the facility to eject somebody from a meeting. Now, if you eject somebody, you want the setting there so that they're not allowed to rejoin once they've been kicked out. So those are just a couple of thoughts about Zoom bombing, given that it's so typical at the moment. I think one of the big problems in cyber that people don't necessarily give enough airspace to is social engineering. And social engineering is the working of people, the manipulation of people so that they give up confidential information. And I think a brilliant example of this is one of my favorite anecdotes about social engineering, which happened to a client. And the lady on reception at this client, her name's Sylvia. Sylvia received a phone call one morning, and the person said to her, we're doing a quiz this morning, and if you can answer 3 questions correctly, you can win a magnum of champagne. Have you got time to answer 3 questions? And Sylvia said that she had. And the three questions were, who is the Queen of England? And Sylvia knew who the Queen of England was. Question number 2 was, who's the current Prime Minister in England? And she knew the answer to that too. The third question was, what accountancy software do you use? Now, Sylvia didn't know. And she said, can I put you on hold? And they said, yes, of course you can. So she put them on hold and she called their IT manager. Their IT manager is called Mike. Fantastic guy. We've worked with him for a long time. He's a good IT manager. And Mike and Sylvia are friends. In fact, they were having lunch together that day. And Sylvia said, Mike, quick question. What accountancy software do we use? And he said, we use Sage Line 50. Brilliant. See you at lunchtime. So Sylvia goes back to the guy on the phone and says, we use Sage Line 50. And he said, that's fantastic. You've won a magnum of champagne. Let me take your details and I'll send it to you. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that Sylvia never received her magnum of champagne. But a couple of days later, a phone call came in and they asked to speak to IT. And Sylvia put the call through to Mike. Mike answers the phone. And the person on the end of the phone said, good afternoon, sorry to disturb you. This is Sage Technical Support. And we can see on our system that you use our Line 50 product. Now, unfortunately, the version of the software that you're running, we've discovered a security breach, a security hole, and therefore we're proactively calling all our users this afternoon to advise them and tell them what we've done about it. And Mike said, oh my goodness, what does this mean? What do I need to do? And they said, don't worry, we've caught it, we've fixed it, we've written a patch. It's a really neat patch. We're about to send it to you. You just need to run it on your system and then you've got nothing to worry about. So a few minutes later, Mike receives an email that looks like it's from Sage. Of course, it wasn't, with an attachment, which he ran. And unfortunately, it was a ransomware attack and they wanted $34,000 to unlock all the data on their network. And I guess the thing is, look, I said that we'd worked with Mike for a long time. He's a really switched on, experienced IT guy. And I would say 9 times out of 10, he wouldn't have fallen for this. It's very easy in the cold light of day to think, well, if this was me, I would have been calling Sage to make sure that it really was Sage. I would have been Googling to see whether anybody else had had this same problem and so on. But look, we all have fear buttons. And on this particular day, the scammers pressed Mike's fear buttons and they tricked him. And the problem is, we do business in what is inherently a trusting culture. And we have to trust a bit less. We have to be more skeptical. We must get people to prove their identity and we must validate the source of emails and phone calls. That verification is absolutely vital. So what else do we need to be thinking about right now? I think one of the issues is, what are you allowing to connect to your systems, and just how secure is it? I think this has been amplified recently, where businesses have had to ramp up a work from home deployment. In your business, that might be very controlled and you might have given everybody work computers to do that. But there are lots of businesses where they've just relied on people using their home computers in order to access the work systems. And that's a security concern. And we need to be sure what is it that people are connecting, and how secure is that? A number one rule of security is good antivirus. Antivirus is absolutely vital, and that's easy to manage in the workplace. But how do you know what antivirus people are running on their home machines? You know, and a tip here, one of the things we do is we license our corporate antivirus to also include domestic licenses. So, I mean, I do it as an employee perk so that, you know, staff say, oh, this is fantastic. I don't need to buy my own license for my home machine and my family. But actually, it's a very small cost as a business to make sure that, you know, even before lockdown, more and more businesses have people who have got staff who are using their home equipment to connect in, and you need to make sure that that is secure. And sometimes I get people who say to me, I've got that covered because we use VPN. Well, don't be fooled into thinking that because you've got a VPN, that gives you all the security that you need. That's not what a VPN does. A VPN, a virtual private network, is about privacy. That's what the P is, the virtual private. Virtual private network is about privacy. And what it does is it creates a private tunnel from the machine that it's installed on to the system that it's connecting to. So what that means is if you are working from home over a VPN, the information that you're sending across the web can't be infiltrated because it's private. But it is a tunnel. And what that means is if you've got something at the end of the tunnel that is insecure, then all sorts of nasty stuff can be going through that private tunnel. So it's really important that the devices that you are connecting are secure and that you're taking appropriate steps to ensure that there's nothing nasty going through that tunnel. You also want to be really strict right now, in fact always, but on passwords. And it amazes me how people don't make use of two-factor or multi-factor authentication. This is available for virtually all systems and people don't use it. We saw recently in the press about how Jeff Bezos of Amazon, how he had been scammed over WhatsApp. WhatsApp wasn't the problem. And actually, if he'd turned on multi-factor authentication on WhatsApp, then that wouldn't have been an issue. All the apps that you use, you know, Twitter and LinkedIn and so on, they all have the option of multi-factor authentication. Please turn it on and please ensure that your users are turning it on. We've also seen in recent weeks a spike in a particular scam called sextortion. Now, sextortion, the way this works, I mentioned when I was talking about Mike and Sylvia how people have fear buttons. The way the sextortion scam works and the way this is so successful is the recipient gets an email and it starts to say, John, I know your password is, and then it gives John's password. Now, typically, this is an old password, but it depends on that recipient's password hygiene. Because if somebody isn't changing their passwords frequently, then actually that old password could be still their current password. Or if they use the same password on lots and lots of different sites and services. Now, the way this works is the recipient gets an email and it says, John, I know your password is. And then it says, I breached your computer a number of weeks ago and I've taken control of your webcam. And what I've now created is a video, and on half the screen it shows a website that you were visiting that you shouldn't have been. You shouldn't have been on that site. And then on the other half of the video, it shows what you were doing whilst you were on that dodgy website. And if you don't pay me £5,000 within 24 hours, payable by Bitcoin, so it's not traceable, then I will send that video to all of your contacts. Now, I get a number of phone calls from people who receive this scam, and the state of the person that I'm talking to tells me quite a lot about them, actually. But you know, I've had grown men crying down the phone saying, "Rob, please help me. I don't want my wife or children to see this video." And I've had I've also had people say to me, "Rob, I should say I don't have a webcam." Well, look, there's a massive clue there. If you don't have a webcam, there's absolutely no way that somebody's taken control of your webcam to make a video of you. And the key thing is, look, this is a scam. It's fake. This hasn't happened. But the fear button's being pressed, and the fear button's being pressed because it starts with one of your passwords. Now, the first thing that I do when somebody calls me with one of these problems is I take them to this website that I'm showing you on the screen here. It's called haveibeenpwned.com. Now, Have I Been Pwned was started by Troy Hunt, who's the Microsoft Director of Security, or he was at the time. And pwned was actually a typo. So what it should have been is haveibeenowned.com. So in street speak, if I scam you, then I own you. So the site originally should have been haveibeenowned.com, but it was a typo, and it's stayed. So haveibeenpwned.com. What I recommend you do is when we finish the call later this morning, go to haveibeenpwned.com and put in your email address, put in your work email address, put in your personal email address. This is completely legit. This was a Microsoft backed site. But what it will show you is every data breach that has happened worldwide, that your email has been a part of that data breach. Most people will come up on that list when you put in your email address. For example, most of us are on LinkedIn. LinkedIn were breached. Adobe were breached. You know, Fitbit, Under Armour, all those people. There's some very large scale breaches in there. The key thing is, do you use the same passwords on those sites? But the reason I take people here is when they say, "Rob, you know, this email starts and it says your password is," I tell people, go to haveibeenpwned.com, put in your email address, and one of the sites that comes up under your email address will be the site that the password that's in that email. Now, this is great, and you can go and you can check and you can see what data breaches you've been a part of. And of course, that's important to do, and it's important to make sure that you've changed your passwords and that you're not using the same passwords on multiple sites. But a word of warning is that cyber criminals can also use this site. So if I were a cyber criminal and I wanted to attack you, if I've got your email address, I can go to haveibeenpwned.com, put in your email address, see the data breaches that you were a part of, and then go onto the dark web and simply buy those data sets. And then I find you in the data set and I find the password that you were using. So don't make those criminals' jobs easy by using a pattern of passwords, because all I've got to do is buy 2 or 3 data sets from the breaches that you were part of, and if I can see any correlation, then that's going to make it an awful lot easier for me to come and attack you now. Another thing that's really important, and one of the things you need to be talking about in our corona world is software updates. Software updates are vitally important, and typically now within the workplace, you are managing those. Your IT company or your IT department will be managing those software updates. You need to make sure that people are also doing software updates on their machines at home. Go back to the concept of the VPN and that tunnel and what's being sent down that tunnel. A lot of software updates are security fixes. You know, Microsoft roll out security fixes every single month on their Update Tuesday. And if you cast your mind back sort of 2 years, we had the NHS cyber attack. And the NHS cyber attack, as it was reported in the press, shut down 75% of NHS trusts. They had to stop operating. The thing is, the NHS cyber attack was not an NHS cyber attack. It was a cyber attack called WannaCry. It was sent all around the globe. It just so happens that in the UK, one of the highest profile victims was the NHS. The frustrating thing for me with this is WannaCry was attacking a hole, a security vulnerability in Microsoft Windows. But Microsoft had found that vulnerability and they had fixed it 4 years previously. Now, Microsoft, as a minimum, send out updates once a month, sometimes more frequently than that. Those updates are also periodically all rolled together in what they call a service pack. And for 4 years, 75% of NHS trusts hadn't loaded any of those secure updates. And if they had, they wouldn't have been able to be attacked. So it's really important that we get a grip on that. And if you're reliant on somebody else, if you're reliant on your IT department or an IT company to do this, request proof. Actually get validation that this is being done. I think something else that is a big problem is phishing, and I've already mentioned that we've seen an increase in COVID related phishing. A bigger problem than phishing is whaling. And whaling is a phishing attack aimed at the big fish in an organization. It's sometimes called CEO crime. And the way this typically plays out is you get an email that is supposedly from the CEO to the accounts team saying, I need you to pay this urgently. And unfortunately, in the UK, there is a successful whaling attack every 15 minutes of every working day. And I define success as money being paid out. And whenever that happens, there's typically a conversation where when I'm talking to staff who have been involved in this, where we're doing sort of cybersecurity work with victims of these crimes, you'll get someone who say, the thing is, it's more than my job's worth not to do what my boss tells me to do. And I was so convinced that it was from my boss. Well, if that's your culture, that needs to be changed. And through education, people should be of the mindset that it's more than their job's worth to ever make a payment based on an email instruction. Email inherently is not secure, and nobody should be making a payment based on an email. And this is true for you at work, but it's also true for you in your personal life. You know, if your mate sends you an email about, you know, a trip away, I'm sure those days will happen again, asking for payment, then it's vitally important that you don't do it off the back of the email. We see a lot of what we call man in the middle attacks, and a man in the middle attack is you send an email and it's intercepted, edited, and then forwarded. There's a lot of this with invoice crime, man in the middle attack, invoice crime. So I'm doing work for you. You've placed an order for me to come in and do cybersecurity training in your business, and you've issued a purchase order reference. It's on your system. We're a supplier. Uh, there's a date, a product, a service, a PO reference, and so on. If we were a victim of a man in the middle attack, my accounts team sends you an invoice. The man in the middle attack intercept that email and they edit the invoice. And all they do to the invoice is, in this example, is they put a line across it that says, please note on you bank details. So your accounts team receive an invoice that they're expecting and it all tallies up, but there's this line across it that says, please note our new bank details. It's absolutely vital that if your accounts team get one of those, that they pick up the phone and they talk to the invoice issuer to make sure it's legit. And don't use the phone number that's on the invoice either. Make sure you go back to your system records and you phone and you verify it. And I was doing some training for a firm of accountants a couple of months ago, and they said, well, it's quite interesting because at the beginning of the year we did change our bank details. So every single invoice that we've sent out since the beginning of the year has a line across it saying, please note our new bank details. And I said, out of interest, how many of your customers have phoned up to validate that? And they said you could count on one hand. People aren't doing it, and it's vital that you do. Think too about physical security. Think about ways in which people might be trying to attack you. And think about USB keys. I wonder what would happen. A really common form of attack. If I'm a cyber criminal and I want to attack you, one of the easy things I can do is throw some USB keys at you, sometimes literally. So there are, people will drop a USB key in reception. Or one of the common things that we see is people will put a USB key on some keys, on a key ring, and then they'll drop the keys in the company's car park. This relies on the fact that people are inherently helpful. So if a member of your team found a bunch of keys outside your office and there was no way of identifying whose those keys were, but there's a USB key on it, what would they do? And you need the answer to be, if somebody found a USB key, they would throw it away. What you can't have is anybody finding a random USB key and sticking it in the drive, because that's such an easy way for a cyber criminal to attack you. And I was doing a talk last week, and one of the attendees said, well, bizarrely, I received a padded envelope at home yesterday with a USB key in it, and I've no idea who it came from. And she said, and I've not done anything with it. And I said, well, that's absolutely right, and you mustn't, because it's a really easy way for a criminal to attack. There's a scam doing the rounds at the moment because of the coronavirus, and this the COVID-19 redundancy scam plays on a vulnerability in Microsoft Excel. And the way cyber criminals use Microsoft Excel is through macros. And a macro is a list of instructions that is designed to copy data from one sheet to another, or to update one worksheet or one workbook from one to another. But a list of macros could be any instructions, and one of those instructions could be to to run a program, download a program from a website and install it. So one of the things that we can do here is make sure that IT are controlling who actually has macros, because most people will have Excel, but very few of those users actually need macros. So what we do is we have two groups of users for Excel, and this is managed centrally for us, and you get people who are allowed macros and those who aren't. The way this particular scam works is it's making use of that Excel trick, but you get a spoofed email. So you imagine you log in tomorrow morning and you see that there's an email from one director of your business to another director of the business, and it's accidentally CC'd to all staff. And what the email says is, Jane, ahead of our board meeting on Monday, I attach an Excel spreadsheet showing all the proposed COVID-19 redundancies. Now, if you're a member of staff and you get that email, you think, oh my goodness, this is the first I've heard of redundancies. And there's an Excel spreadsheet attached. It only takes one person to open that Excel spreadsheet and say yes to enable macros, and they deliver their ransomware attack. So be aware of that and make sure you're talking about that. And I think one of the other things that we need to be aware of is the cybersecurity threat gap. Now, if you're not doing anything about cybersecurity at the moment, you don't need to worry about the threat gap. Where the threat gap comes into place is where companies are investing in technology, they're doing cyber training, and then they've got their processes. And unfortunately, these three things can become siloed. And it's even more of an issue, I think, right now, where some people have, rapidly deployed work from home, but people are having to work around the system because their normal processes or their normal technology doesn't allow them to do their job. And it's the gaps in the workaround that is the threat gap, and that's where you become at risk. And just a reminder, when I started this session and we were talking about the responsibilities of GDPR, what you can't do if you are a director of your business, you cannot outsource responsibility for cybersecurity. And it's not just a technology problem. It's not an IT problem. Cybersecurity is inherent in everything that we do, in our products, our services, our people, our processes, and whatever the technology is. And the board needs to know that it's their responsibility. And whilst GDPR says you have a legal responsibility to do cybersecurity training, it's also vital that you're doing cybersecurity training for your board and that the board can demonstrate that they've received appropriate education. PwC do a great report every year, the annual Global CEO Survey. And if you've never seen it, it's worth downloading. Just Google it. It's free of charge. Really, really good. They survey CEOs of businesses of all sizes around the globe. I get interviewed every year, and the report is really interesting. But one of the things that jumped out to me was that 60% of CEOs ranked cyber threats as a top threat to their growth. And yet, very few of them have got board colleagues, who are raising cybersecurity as an issue. And you need to know, as a director, what the state of your cyber readiness is. You've got to get this in the boardroom. And when I was talking about your reporting requirements, to the ICO, you need to be able to prove, you need an audit trail to prove that you're taking this seriously and that you're doing things properly. And, just a sanity check, how many of you as directors can confidently say that cybersecurity has been a board agenda item? And if it hasn't, you need to get cybersecurity on your agenda and in your minutes so that you can prove that you are taking this seriously. You've also got to have a cyber response plan. Your business needs to know how to respond when they get a cyber attack, and they will get a cyber attack. Every one of us will get a cyber attack. And this was also in the PwC report in terms of, do you have a cyber response plan? 19% didn't know, and 14% didn't intend to implement a plan. Well, that's breaking the law, because GDPR says you must have a cyber response plan. People need to know what to do and make it as simple as possible. Have a one-page plan. I'm assuming you've got a business continuity plan. If you've got a business continuity plan, it amazes me how many business continuity plans I review that are planning for all sorts of risks, but they're not planning for cyber. Unfortunately, you are more likely to suffer a business interruption because of cyber than you are because of a flood or a fire. So get that plan in place. You can't template this. I can't give you a plan because it needs to be specific for your business. But make sure you've got one. Make sure it's clear. We've got ours up in the staff room, so it's easy for people to access. And remember that both GDPR and cybersecurity education are an ongoing journey. May the 25th, 2018 was not a destination. Some people said to me at the time, well, is this like the millennium bug? And it's not. The 25th of May 2018 was when the law changed. It was when GDPR took over the governance of cybersecurity, and it needed to happen. The Data Protection Act was 20 years old, and the way that we use technology has changed so much during that time period. So, we need to make sure that we're compliant. And when you think about GDPR, think about, what data is being generated and where it is and how it's being protected, and has that changed because of your remote working? Has that changed because you've now got people working from home? And I mentioned earlier about DPIAs. Anytime your systems change, that should trigger a DPIA. So as a business right now, you should be thinking about doing a DPIA for your business. When I imagine any organization, when I imagine your business, I envisage this pipe that you can see here going through your business, and this pipe goes through every department, through every floor. It goes through every home worker and every location, and it twists and it turns, and there are joints all along the pipe, and at every joint is a member of your team, and that person needs to know that it's her job or his job to protect their bit of the security pipe. The other reason I use this image is that it's not that long ago that it was this one person on top of the pipe, and that would have been the IT manager, and it was her job or his job to protect the entire pipe from a security point of view. And the job is too big. It's a shared responsibility. In terms of protecting your pipe, it has to be the entire business. That's why we have to be so tight on our education. But in terms of responsibility, it's the directors of the business. When you have a breach, you cannot say it's the IT manager's fault or it was the IT provider's fault. Legally, it's your problem. And I think because of that, and when we talk about the human firewall, that was my first slide that I shared with you, talking about the human firewall. It's really good to test that. Best practice says you should be booking penetration tests. And a penetration test is where in effect, a friendly hacker is going to try and breach your system. And then they give you a report back in terms of what they were able to do and what they found. And you do that within a brief. Various things to say to you about penetration testing. The first is get this done independently. Don't let your IT team do their own penetration testing. For our clients where we're managing your IT, we don't do our own penetration testing of your systems. We work with other penetration testers and we get them to do it. And the way to think about this is you don't ask your children to mark their own homework. And this is how it works with pen testing. The other thing that I always recommend is don't use the same pen test company every time. We've got some government contracts that we work on, and there we have to provide penetration testing services every year, but we're not allowed to use the same penetration testing company more than once every 3 years. And I think that's actually a really healthy routine. So we use different testers, but test it. Uh, the other thing is when you book a penetration test, one of the options is to have a social penetration test. And again, I really recommend this. So a standard pen test will be trying to get in to your IT from a technology point of view. A social pen test will be working of people, and they will make phone calls and they may well visit your business and use all the tricks and the scams to try and get in, and then you get a report back to say this is what we found. And each time you do it, and every time you do it, they will find something, because in the same way that our technology responds and improves, so do the scammers techniques. So each time you do it and you get that report, we then sit down and say, okay, what can we now do to mitigate that? So that's really important. And remember, you've just got to drip feed this. The Harvard study that we discussed, an intelligent person needs to hear something 6 times before they get it. And I think one of the things that I would say is that people have different learning preferences. I said show that video. That will work for some people, but it won't for others. Some people want to read policy. Some people need the combination of two. Um, we do education through showing people how the scams work, through talks, through tests, through quizzes, through videos, all of those things. Drip feed it. It's interesting. GDPR says that you have to train. What it doesn't say is how often. Um, and I think I've heard GDPR described as being a toddler law. And where they're talking about it being a toddler law, they're saying it's still very young and there isn't the case law yet to interpret the law. Um, we do know that you've got to do training. We don't know how often that that training needs to be. I take the Harvard mindset and say, well, if someone's got to hear something at least 6 times, that gives you a clue as to the sort of level of activity that you need to be thinking about. But make sure that you continue. This is most definitely not a one-off exercise, or a document or a process isn't going to protect you. Okay, well, thank you. If you've enjoyed the session, I've got a couple of books that you might find useful, which you can get on Amazon. They're short guides that help, I think, in the training. I hope that this has been useful. Stay safe, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you very much.